All right, we're getting it going here. All right, we are live.
Welcome to Medieval Times. If you've not been with us for the last 3 years or so, you might want to check out Discovering His Story, my program at yctv.org, which is Youngstown Christian Television, yctv.org. There I have started back at the beginning again and have worked my way to this point up to ancient Egypt. And I think there are some fascinating things concerning the Bible and ancient Egypt, things that occur in the Bible. And I've researched more. So the things that I gave you 3 years ago, I've added a bunch of stuff to that. In fact, even this past week, I came across some more information that I'm already past in Discovering His Story. But the next time I record, I'm going to stop the program and say, here's something else that goes back to where we were. So I hope that if you're interested in the Bible, or even if you're not interested in history, if you're interested in the Bible, of course, a lot of it is history. You'll check that out.
What was the site again?
YCTV. But it's got to go further than a sticker. It's got to go onto your computer, or laptop, whatever. If you have Roku, you can tune in live. If you go to the website, you not only can see what's live, but you can go down to my program, for example, or others, and see the archived ones. So I think I'm up to episode like 13 or 14, but you can go back to episode 1, which deals with evidence for a young Earth from outside the Bible. And then the next episode, I talk about the missing links, cavemen, things like that, and dinosaurs. And then the next is the flood, I think, and next after that is Babel and so on. So that we're in ancient Egypt at this point, ready to reveal the route that the Israelites took on their way to Mount Sinai, and where Mount Sinai really is. And if you weren't here to hear the story, how many of you are here to hear the story of my climb up Mount Sinai?
Yeah.
Okay. People seem to enjoy it at the time. I don't know if you will when it's on a screen like that, but it's being played this week. I just saw it this afternoon. But tonight we're looking at medieval times, which is the same thing as the Middle Ages. And we've covered basically 2 out of the 3 parts of the Middle Ages. We're now in the 3rd and final section of the Middle Ages. And that begins around 1300, maybe a little before, depending, no dates are exact. But tonight we're going to look at what was perceived to be the end of the world. And that is the Black Death. How many of you have heard of the Black Death or the bubonic plague? All right, almost everybody. Devastating to Europe. And we're going to talk about that. In October 1347, when a Genoese, that is a trading ship from Genoa in Italy, one of the major traders at the time, came from the Crimea near Turkey, docked at a harbor in Sicily, which is pointed up there by the blue arrow. This trading ship, on board this trading ship, there were dead and dying men laying at the oars. The sailors had black swellings the size of eggs in their armpits and groins, swellings that oozed blood and pus, and spreading boils and black blotches on the skin from internal bleeding. The sick endured pain and died within 5 days of the first symptoms. The first symptoms of bubonic plague often appear within several days and included headache and a general feeling of weakness, followed by aches and chills in the upper leg and groin, a white coating on the tongue, rapid pulse, slurred speech, confusion, fatigue, apathy, and a staggering gait. A blackish pustule usually will form at the point of the flea bite. By the third day, the lymph nodes begin to swell. The heart begins to flutter rapidly as it tries to pump blood through swollen, suffocating tissues. Subcutaneous hemorrhaging occurs, causing purplish blotches on the skin. The victim's nervous system begins to collapse, causing dreadful pain and bizarre neurological disorders. By the fourth or fifth day, wild anxiety and terror overtake the sufferer, and then a sense of resignation as the skin blackens and the rictus of death settles on the body. Other symptoms appeared in some of the next victims: continuous fever and spitting of blood. These victims coughed, sweated heavily, and died within 3 days or less, sometimes in 24 hours. In both types, everything that issued from the body, breath, sweat, blood from the buboes, those are the lumps, and lungs, bloody urine, and blood-blackened excrement smelled foul. No matter the symptoms, everything about the victims smelled foul, and depression and despair fell over them when they contracted the disease, because they knew there was no cure. No one even knew what it was or where it came from. The disease, we sometimes call it bubonic plague, was so lethal that some went to bed well and died before morning. Some doctors caught the illness at the patient's bedside and died before the patient. Bubonic plague presented itself in various forms, which are only known after the fact. Hundreds of years later, these things were discovered. There's one that infected the bloodstream, causing internal bleeding, and was spread by contact. This was called septicemic. Then there was the bubonic, which attacked the lymph nodes, causing large swellings called buboes, and the more virulent pneumonic type that infected the lungs and was spread by respiratory infection. Next in your notes, the extent. It was borne by ships traveling the coasts and rivers. By early 1348, the plague had penetrated Italy, North Africa, France, and crossed the English Channel. At the same time, it moved across the Alps into Switzerland and reached eastward to Hungary. In a given area, the plague wreaked its havoc within 4 to 6 months and then faded, except in larger cities. There, it slowed in winter, only to reappear in spring to rage for another 6 months. In 1349, it hit Paris again and began spreading through England, Scotland, and Ireland, as well as Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Prussia, and Iceland, sometimes in chilling fashion. Off the coast of Norway, a ship drifted aimlessly offshore, finally grounding itself in Bergen. On boarding the ship, people discovered a load of wool and a dead crew. By mid-1350, the plague had passed through most of Europe. The mortality rate ranged from 20% in some cases to 90% in others. In many rural villages, the last survivors moved away and the village sank back into the wilderness, leaving only grass-covered mounds. Overall, the estimate of one medieval observer matches that of modern demographers. This person said, 1/3 of the world died. That would have meant about 20 million deaths. Now, what's the primary concern? Since you don't know where it came from or how to cure it, well, how do you bury all the bodies? When graveyards filled up, bodies at Avignon were thrown into the Rhone River until mass burial pits were dug. In London, corpses piled up until they overflowed out of the pits. Corpses were left in front of doorways, and the light of each morning revealed new piles of bodies. Some of the dead were buried so hurriedly that the thinly covered bodies were dragged out and consumed by dogs. Another concern developed when the spread of death and fear accelerated so quickly that last rites and prayers could seldom be performed prior to the death of individuals. Well, what does that mean to those that are dying and their families? If they don't get last rites, their sins aren't forgiven, and therefore they go to hell, or maybe spend a longer time in purgatory, but it's not a good thing for them. Emotionally, they think I'm dying and now I can't even get last rites. So that increased terror to those who are dying brought about some adjustments. A bishop in England gave permission to laymen to make confession to each other, as he said, as was done by the apostles. If no man is present, then even to a woman. And if no priest could be found to administer extreme unction, last rites, then faith must suffice. So interesting. I don't mean to laugh, but here in desperate times, they decided to revert back to the Bible. Well, here's what they did in biblical times. I guess that'll have to do. Pope Clement VI found it necessary to grant remissions of sin to all who died of the plague, because so many were unattended by priests. Rather than encourage mutual aid, the plague's deadliness drove people from one another. One Sicilian friar reported, magistrates and notaries refused to come and make the wills of the dying. And worse, even the priests did not come to hear their confessions. In one account called the Decameron, the author said, one man shunned another, kinsfolk held aloof, brother was forsaken by brother, oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to believe, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children to their fate, untended, unvisited, as if they had been strangers. Lawlessness and debauchery accompanied the plague, as they had during the Great Plague of Athens in 430 BC. When at that time, according to Thucydides, men grew bold in the indulgence of pleasure. Thucydides says this, foreseeing how the rich died in a moment and those who had nothing immediately inherited their property, they reflected that life and riches were alike transitory, and they resolved to enjoy themselves while they could. Not too dissimilar from what was happening during the Black Death. When the disease had not yet reached Scotland, inhabitants of that land rejoiced over the plight of the English to their south and assembled for an invasion, laughing at their enemies. Before they could put their plans into action, the savage mortality fell upon them too, scattering some in death and the rest in panic to spread the infection as they fled. Yet there were also pockets of extraordinary Christian charity. According to one French chronicler, the nuns at one city hospital, having no fear of death, tended the sick with all sweetness and humility. New nuns replaced those who died until most had died. Many times renewed by death, someone wrote, they now rest in peace with Christ, as we may piously believe. The higher rates of death occurred, interestingly, among the young, as well as women, clergy, doctors, and the poor, with peasants dropping dead on the roads, in the fields, and in their houses. As peasants grew more and more hopeless, They became apathetic about performing their daily tasks, leaving fields unharvested and animals unattended. Unharvested fields not only meant a lack of food for the winter, but also no seed plant the next spring. Livestock also succumbed to the plague, including English sheep. I read one account of 5,000 of them in a field dying of the plague, in one field alone. Their bodies so corrupted by the plague that neither beast nor bird would touch them, and spreading an appalling stench. It is said that wolves in the Austrian Alps, when stalking sheep in the valley, appeared to be alarmed by some invisible warning and then turned and fled back into the wilderness. Even dogs and cats died. Any comments or questions before we get to the remedies? Not a happy topic. Yes.
When you talk about their last rites, now what religion were they practicing?
Roman Catholic. The Roman Catholic, Roman Catholicism is the only Christianity there is at this time. And all of Europe is Roman Catholic. Any other questions? I'm sure you're interested in the remedies.
You didn't mention about the spreading, but it was other thing talked about, through the rats and through the fleas.
Yeah,
and all that.
I'm going to talk about that specifically later on, because I'm kind of approaching it from the standpoint of people that were there, what they see going on, and they didn't know what the causes were. So if it's all right, we'll hold off on that. Although I have kind of hinted at it, and you all know from your own reading. All right, let's go to the remedies. To those who could afford to do so, the logical course of action from the dreaded pandemic was flight. Or holding up, if you're wealthy enough, you can hold up in your own little castle or whatever. It reminds me of a story written by Edgar Allan Poe called Masque of the Red Death. Anybody ever remember reading that? I was going to read it because it's so similar to the situation, but I thought it would take too long. But the story, the Masque of the Red Death, is that there's an epidemic going on, and this wealthy nobleman invites all his friends to a party. It's like they're going to party in face of all the devastation that's taking place outside his walls, and he feels that they're safe within his walls. But during the course of the evening, there is a person with a red mask that leads people into another room, and little by little, the people that are there die. So they weren't protected from the plague after all. Government was sometimes ruthless. Archbishop Giovanni Visconti of Milan ordered that the first three houses in which the plague was discovered were to be walled up with their occupants inside, enclosing the well, sick, and dead in a common tomb. Well, whether this helped or not cannot be definitively determined, but Milan did have much less death than other places. A ruler of a manor in England burned and razed an entire village when the plague arrived there in order to prevent it from invading the manor house, a move that was evidently successful because that house is still occupied by descendants of that person. The remedies advised by the medical profession range from the logical to the absurd. Most believed that the theory of humors, along with astrology, was the best explanation. According to humoralism, 4 bodily fluids, blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, determined a person's temperament, and an imbalance led to certain sicknesses dependent upon which humors were in excess or deficit. The humors were connected to celestial bodies, seasons, body parts, and stages of life. So that was their idea of medicine. In order to draw out the poison, some doctors used bloodletting. Purging with laxatives was also done, or enemas. lancing or cauterizing the buboes, or application of hot plasters. None of this was of much use. Medicines range from pills of powdered stag's horn or myrrh and saffron to potions of potable gold. Compounds of rare spices and powdered pearls or emeralds were prescribed. Doctors advised that floors should be sprinkled and hands, mouth, and nostrils washed with vinegar and rose water. Bland diets, avoidance of excitement and anger, especially at bedtime, mild exercise, and removal wherever possible from swamps and other sources of dank air were all recommended. See, because some of them felt that it was bad air that's doing it. So get away from swamps and places like that. Pomanders made of exotic compounds were to be carried on going out, probably more as antidote to the plague's odors than to its contagion. So if you look at this plague doctor picture, you can see the different elements that are part of his makeup. There's the leather hat, there's a glass eye, and then good through his eyes. Here's the beak stuffed with herbs and spices, and either to protect from getting it or at least make things smell better. A mask cornered at the neck, wooden stick to keep people away. Full-length gown covered with wax worn over leather breeches, leather gloves, and full-length leather boots. Kind of reminds me of what we saw during COVID. That's their version of it anyway. Here's a close-up look at the mask, a leather mask, which can be filled with all kinds of good smelling stuff.
It was designed by Dr. Fauci.
Yeah. Yeah. I won't say anything. Conversely, in the curious belief that latrine attendants were immune, many people visited the public latrines on the theory that foul odors were efficacious. All right, now let's look at the causes, the real causes, before we look at some of what they thought. Again, in all likelihood, writes Charles L. Mee, Jr., a flea riding on the back of or on the hide of a black rat entered the Italian port of Messina. The flea had a gut full of the Bacillus Yersinia pestis. What made the plague even worse was the fact that no one knew its cause, its prevention, or its cure. A French priest in Avignon wrote that the mystery behind the pestilence was the most terrible of all the terrors. Undetected for another 500 years, the real cause was a bacterium living alternately in the stomach of the flea and the bloodstream of the rat, who was the flea's host, transferred to humans and animals by the bite of either rat or flea. Fumes from an earthquake and bad or poisoned air arising from stagnant lakes or other sources were prominent sources considered, although the official perspective of the medical faculty of the University of Paris centered on a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the 40th degree of Aquarius, which occurred on March 20th, 1345. That's what brought about the plague. That was science. Believe the science, follow the science. But this is what really happened. So you can really get it a couple different ways. Flea bite, rat bite, who had infected fleas bitten the rat. And this doesn't take into consideration the pneumatic kind, which was actually through the air. It was a long respiratory disease. And all these are going on at the same time. Now, if you're living in that situation, seeing no real cause, except for the conjunction of planets, and seeing so many people dying, and knowing at least a little bit about what the Bible says, what conclusion might you come to? That we are suffering under God's wrath. So appeasing God's wrath became important. The initiation of the plague in Italy followed on the heels of several calamitous events, including the Florentine bankruptcies, the crop failure and workers' riots of 1346 to 47, the revolt of Cola di Rienzi that plunged Rome into anarchy, and coincided with a fearsome earthquake that carved a path of wreckage from Naples up to Venice. Houses collapsed, church towers toppled, villages were crushed, and the destruction reached as far as Germany and Greece. One observer reported, and people said and believed, this is the end of the world. When I hear people talk today about stuff that's happening in America, how America is going downhill morally, or hear them talk about hurricanes or earthquakes. By the way, there were no major hurricanes this past year. That's got to make the futurists upset. And they think that all these are indications that the end of the world is coming. I want to take them back to the Black Death and see what would you have thought then. To most people, there was but one exclamation for the calamity: the wrath of God. A scourge so sweeping had to be divine punishment for sin. One writer compared the plague to the flood and believed he was recording the extermination of mankind. Pope Clement VI acknowledged as much in a bull. A bull is an official document in September 1348, where he spoke of the pestilence with which God is afflicting the Christian people. Such great wrath had to be due to great sins. There was endless guilt, as there was a plethora of possibilities in a society where sin could be as menial as missing mass and as great as adultery, blasphemy, or murder. Efforts to appease God's wrath took many forms, but the most common were processions, as you see here, authorized at first by the Pope. Some lasted as long as 3 days, and some were attended by as many as 2,000, which of course just helped spread the plague. Penitents went barefoot and wore sackcloth. They sprinkled themselves with ashes, wept, prayed, tore their hair, carried candles and relics. They wound through city streets, begging for mercy from Jesus, Mary, and the saints. When the plague refused to abate, the processions moved from ceremonies of remorse to self-flagellation. Are you familiar with that term? It means you're taking a whip and beating yourself. You see that practiced particularly in Latin America countries today, Roman Catholic procedures. The flagellants believed they were society's redeemers. They were going to take the punishment for society in God's eyes. And they reenacted Christ's scourging on their own bodies to atone for human sin. Again, you have to reflect on the fact that it was because they had been taught that Jesus's suffering and death were not sufficient to pay for their sins to begin with, that they then resorted to such activity to try to atone for the sins of the people due to the wrath of God evident in this great plague. Stripped to the waists, beating themselves with leather whips tipped with iron spikes until the blood flowed, groups of 200 to 300, and sometimes up to 1,000, marched from city to city. They begged Christ and Mary for pity and townspeople sobbed and groaned in sympathy. They performed 3 times a day, twice publicly in the church square and once in private. They were organized under a lay master for usually 33 and a half days to represent Christ's years on earth. They pledged self-support and obedience to the master, that is the lay master. They were not allowed to bathe, shave, change clothes, sleep in beds, talk, or have intercourse with women without the master's permission. The movement quickly spread from Germany through the Low Countries to France. Hundreds of bands roamed the land, exciting already overwrought emotions in city after city. Inhabitants greeted them with the ringing of church bells and offered them hospitality. Children were brought to them to be healed. People dipped cloths into flagellant's blood and pressed the cloths to their eyes and preserved them as relics. The flagellants quickly grew arrogant and began overtly attacking the church. Masters began hearing confessions, granting absolution, and imposing penance, which is something that only who should have been doing, according to the church. Who does those things in the church? The priests. Priests tried to stop them. And when they did, they were stoned. Opponents were denounced as antichrists. The flagellants took over churches, disrupted services, ridiculed the Eucharist, looted altars, and claimed the power to cast out demons and raise the dead. Eventually, church and state got the upper hand. When Pope Clement VI called for their arrest, the flagellants disbanded and fled, vanishing as suddenly as they had come, wrote one witness, like night phantoms or mocking ghosts. All right, any comments or questions about appeasing God's wrath? Pretty horrible times. And in some ways, it's going to get worse as we go to murderous atonement. Then the self-torturers and other Christians turn their anxiety upon another group. If all the beating of ourselves and all that stuff hasn't turned God's wrath, then maybe that's not the problem. Maybe the problem is the Jews. Jews were suspected of poisoning city wells, intending to kill and destroy the whole of Christendom and have lordship over all the world. Now, those rumors have been going around for centuries, but now it became more intense. Lynchings began in the spring of 1348, following the first plague deaths. In France, Jews were dragged from their houses and thrown into bonfires. Pope Clement VI tried to stop the hysteria, to his credit. He said Christians who imputed the pestilence to the Jews had been seduced by that liar, the devil, and that the charge of well poisoning and the massacres were a horrible thing. He urged priests to take Jews under their protection, as he himself offered to do, but his voice was hardly heard in the rush to find a scapegoat. In one town, an entire community of several hundred Jews was burned in a wooden house especially constructed for the purpose. The 2,000 Jews of Strasbourg, France, were taken to the cemetery, where those who didn't convert were burned in rows of stakes. We were talking just prior to our session this evening about persecution of the Jews and how it has been evident in European Christendom throughout the Middle Ages. And so this was not something that came out of thin air. And part of it goes back to what we looked at before, in that the church prohibited Christians from loaning money. And so in order to borrow money, the only ones who could do that, or who could loan it, were Jews. And so they became the financiers, they became the bankers, and were hated for it by those that owed the money, even though that was the only ones that they could get it from. And so that animosity just at different times, different events would build up, and the Jews became the focus. Any other comments here or questions? All right, next, angry aftermath. The plague broke out about once a decade over the next 60 years in various places. Yet for all the excess of sorrow and death, there were few profound, lasting effects on society. Some noted the sad effect on morals, lowering virtue throughout the world, someone said. There was an orgy of greed with the glut of merchandise available in the aftermath. Got all this product and fewer people to buy it. Peasants took unclaimed tools and livestock. The poor moved into deserted houses, slept on beds, and ate off silver. Lawsuits to gain deserted lands proliferated. Others noted an improvement. Many people living together got married, and swearing and gambling had so diminished that manufacturers of dice were turning their product into beads for saying prayers. Sort of got the fear of God put in them. Higher education benefited. Emperor Charles IV felt deeply the cause of precious knowledge, which the mad rage of pestilential death has stifled throughout the wide realms of the world. He founded the University of Prague in the plague year of 1348. By 1353, 3 new colleges were founded at Cambridge, one of them funded by the income derived from masses for the dead. So can you imagine how many masses are being said for the dead? And you got to pay for those. So the church was also enriched. First by the offerings of pilgrims who in 1350 flocked to Rome seeking absolution from their sins. Also, a flood of bequests were made to religious institutions. And in October 1348, the Council of Siena temporarily suspended its annual taxes for religious charities because these were so immensely enriched and indeed fattened by bequests. But the church also garnered much criticism. Most clergy turned out to be as frightened and self-serving as the populace, some gouging people for their services during the crisis. This was severely condemned by Pope Clement VI and violently resented by the people. In Worcester, England, for example, citizens broke down the gates of a priory, attacked the monks, and tried to set fire to the buildings. Wrote one contemporary, "When those who have the title of shepherd play the part of wolves, heresy grows in the garden of the church," unquote. Most people plodded on as before, but dissatisfaction with the church's behavior at a critical moment accelerated reform movements, which were to break out uncontrolled a century and a half later. Conclusion. In other words, from 1347 to about 1350, medieval Europe experienced perhaps the greatest calamity in human history. Paris lost half of its population. Florence, 3 to 4/5 of their population. Venice, Hamburg, and Bremen lost 2/3. In enclosed places such as monasteries and prisons, the infection of one person usually meant that of all. There's probably a childish game that you may have played when you were a kid. I know I did, called Ring Around the Rosie. It comes from this time. It's a rhyme about the plague. It didn't work. It worked last time we tried it.
Sure did.
Okay, I'll just have to tell you. Infected people with the plague would get red circular sores that would smell very bad. So common folks would put flowers on their bodies somewhere inconspicuously, like in their pockets. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies. It may also have been that pockets and pouches were filled with sweet smelling herbs or posies, which were carried due to the belief that the disease was transmitted by bad smells. People who died from the plague would be burned so as to reduce the possible spread of the disease. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Interestingly enough, I remember as a kid going to Bible school, a vacation Bible school at our church, and there's a cemetery right by the church. And not knowing what we were doing, we would sometimes play Ring Around the Rosie on the cemetery grounds, not knowing that how really bad that was. All right, so the death rate was over 60%. What was it for COVID? Wasn't it less than 1%?
It's small.
Yeah. Could you imagine 60%?
Is that 60% of the people that got it?
60% of the
60%
population.
Well, COVID was even less than that because that, it was less than 1% of the people that got
Oh.
it survived it. So
So it was minuscule.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that, yeah, go ahead.
Did you say six, so with that, did you say 60% of the whole population?
Uh-huh.
Thank you.
so you didn't survive it. There was no survivors.
Well, 40% of the people survived.
No, did they get it though and survived it, or 40% didn't get it?
Yeah, yeah.
Everybody that got it didn't survive.
No, some who got it survived, but there were some who didn't get it, if they were living away
No,
from
I
everybody else.
understand. I just didn't know if there was a.
But 60% of the population is the best estimate died. I've seen some estimated as high as 70-75%. But can you
I
imagine?
just wonder what the legality of this disease was as far as if you got it, 90% of the people that got it died,
Yeah, I don't know that there's any way to tell that for certain, except anecdotally.
I read about it, it would be like if you got it, you're like 97%.
Yeah.
Okay, the ones who lived were few.
It seems like what I've read is that you would get it, and within, like I said, sometimes within 24 hours, sometimes three to 5 days, you were dead. There was not much hope. There were some whose physical constitutions were apparently able to withstand it. But 60% of the population is a huge amount. I think about what that does to, well, I'll talk about some of the things. In London, the only thing that halted the plague was the Great Fire of London in 1666. That's 300 some years later. So the plague is still going, off and on over all those years. The Great Fire of London killed the rats, which carried the disease, which was transmitting via water sources.
Well, to put it in perspective, there's 10 people, excluding you in the room. 6 of us would be dead.
Yeah.
That would leave this side of the room alive, and the rest of us would be gone.
That's an awful lot. The plague led to a shortage of manpower, as you would imagine, leading surviving workers to demand higher wages. Supply and demand. There are fewer laborers, or the laborers are needed, and so you're going to pay more for them. But the lack of population growth for the next 2 generations led also to a lower demand for goods, a drop in production, no chance for advancement in business, and discontentedness as men fought for control of old businesses instead of starting new ones. So it slammed the economy major, if you can imagine, as well. This shows you by color and date. I don't know if you can see the dates. It begins at the top. 1346 is the dark green, and then 1347 is the dark red, and then as year by year. Last year is 1351, and later the lighter colors. This divides it up by lines. You can see the progression by lines from 1347 to 1350.
Yes, I was gonna ask about, there's trade going on. So how did it, I saw the one showed a little bit on the coast of Africa. Did it, penetrate east and south into Asia and into Africa and like that, or?
Well, either we don't have as much of the records of that area as we do of Europe, or it didn't go that direction, or had already been that direction. There's some think that it came from the east. There are reports of similar plague in China. I can't remember now whether it was like 100 years earlier or maybe less. I can't remember how long before that. I didn't go into it because it was so speculative. But it's thought that it originated there, and so that they had experienced in Asia plagues as well before this.
I heard it originally in Wuhan.
You heard what?
Wuhan.
Wuhan?
In a lab in Wuhan.
Wuhan, yeah. Well, that would that'd be an interesting thesis. Do all plagues come from China? I don't know. The difference was that the Western Europeans weren't financing the development of the plague. Any other comments or questions about the plague? Would have been an extremely difficult time to live through. Can't even imagine what it would be like.
No, I know the time isn't right, but one of the things in Luther's history is.
Yeah.
Is it a resurgence?
That's a
of this?
resurgence.
Is it? Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And-
Plague in America built it in the 20s, what was that called?
When?
In the 1920s. What was that plague in America?
There was a flu epidemic, but that was before that.
The Spanish.
Yeah, that was in the 19 teens.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, during World War I. It's spread by American soldiers who were in the war. Yeah, it was called. We'll probably never get to that exactly, but it's called the Spanish flu, but it didn't originate in Spain. I can't remember the reason they called it Spanish flu is because they didn't want to call it anything for any of their countries. But
They think it originated in Iowa and they took it. to
yeah,
Spain.
actually, I think that's the case.
Pretty sure.
Yeah,
My grandmother died of
yeah. My grandmother lost her hair, and she kept it.
that. So,
And every time we would go to her house, she would get it out of the attic and show us her red hair. Oh, that's so interesting, Grandma.
I read it started in Wuhan.
The
China.
bubonic plague.
Yeah, the influenza. Trying
Oh,
to
the-
find all roads lead to China.
Any other comments or questions? All right, I think that we'll stop there because that's a good stopping point, because next we're going to go into medieval learning and art, and see how education began to flourish after the Black Death. There are eventually some good things that come out of it, but it's terrible time to live through. All right, any final questions?
Was there ever a cure ever found for this or just?
The Great Fire.
So they just ran its course?
Yeah, apparently. I mean, at the time, they didn't even have an idea of how it was spreading, let alone how to keep it from spreading, except sometimes fire was used, but even looking back, I've not read where anybody said anything other than it died out. And it may be that people developed an immunity, which happens over time. I don't know. That's a very good question, but I don't know the answer.
The awful part of the built immunity. Most everybody.
If almost everybody's dying, yeah, I know.
You know, that's one of the things I was talking to my son about. COVID virus. And he claims that all viruses mutate
Mhm,
until they mutate themselves out of existence.
mhm,
Their
Right.
object isn't to kill the host, it's to be able to live. with
Right.
the host.
right.
So-
Now, this is a bacteria. So
Viruses
I
too.
would think that the same thing would be true. Bacteria are not going to kill their hosts if they've got nowhere else to go. So
Will
don't know.
mutate itself.
I don't know. It could be.
PBS had a really fascinating program about plague over in the early, turn century in, I believe in California. And the doctors that were studying.
Was it the flu or something else?
No, it was the plague.
It was.
It was from the rats.
It was the
It
bubonic
was
plague
from
again.
the rats,
Huh.
yeah. Yeah, it's very fascinating show about the doctors and their research and
Uh-huh.
how they discovered that the cleanliness of everything made the difference.
Yeah, now that you said that, it sounds familiar. And I think that's maybe when a lot of the research was done, looking back, okay, we want to understand this, we need to find out what happened.
They had to
In the
come up with
1300s.
laws,
Yeah,
figure that out.
For what it's worth, the CDC has on their website for the plague. It says modern antibiotics are effective in treating the plague. Without treatment, the disease can cause serious illness or death. Presently, human plague infections continue to occur in rural areas in the western United States. But significantly more cases occur in parts of Africa and Asia.
so it's still around.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think every once in a while you hear something pop up in the news about someplace experiencing the plague, some village somewhere. All right. Good to know that antibiotics will work if you ever catch it. They didn't have that then.
yeah.
All right, well, I hope you, it hasn't been, very exciting. Certainly not a happy thing to look at, but certainly something that is good to know and to see how it affected things later as we're going to be looking at them, including the church. Okay, well, if no more questions, just sit and chat for a while until the kids are done.
I've heard somewhere, I don't know if this or some other thing that spread that. Maybe it's something else, but like the wealthy weren't hit as hard because they ate off the true silver spoons. Silver is antibacterial.
Oh,
And so. They
well, definitely the wealthy didn't get it as much.
they were consuming some of the silver and kill.
Huh. I hadn't heard that part of it. The poor were definitely much more affected than the wealthy.
One story I remember about.
It's a natural, silver is a natural antibiotic.
Huh.
You can go to, you're in town, go to colloidal silver.
Yeah.
It's a very.
Hmm.
It's a very effective.
I've heard that
natural
it's
antibiotic.
healthy for you in some way, but I didn't
Yeah.
know that it was
Yeah,
antibiotic. Yeah,
One
John?
of the stories that I have read about the plague was maybe in the demons. Moved out of London to the castle, Windsor is outside the city.
Mhm.
And they literally put him on the throne in the middle of the room and put candles and everything around him. So nothing could get to him. And he survived. And his family by doing that.
Yeah.
So I don't know if a silver spoon would be enough, but they use silver. Might be infections.
Yeah.
I don't think a silver spoon would high enough silver to really make a difference.
I think it was just that the wealthy were a little more isolated.
They were more isolated and the servants probably died left and right while they were very safe. And there was no rats or mice or anything around them. because it was so deep.
Well, even the servants who lived there in the castle or in the manor would not have been as susceptible either as those living in the town and villages.
part of it we have to realize too is why didn't they think about the fleas? But because.
They're so used to being bitten by
Exactly,
fleas.
that was their daily
Yeah.
life. There was no cure. They lived with fleas their whole life. That was.
Yeah.
you know, that was just their existence. And so it's, you kind of look, you see these movies about the Middle Ages and all that, and you know, just, it was just a really horrific time all around in so many ways. Even in the good times, you had to deal with
Mhm.
all this.
Yeah, stuff I wouldn't want to deal
Yeah.
with. Yeah, it's gotta be a good sermon illustration or somewhere.
Yeah.
They got used to the fleas,
Yeah,
didn't realize it was bringing them death.
there's a great, what's it, Corey Ten Boom illustration about fleas. Have you heard that
Oh,
story?
yeah.
Yeah, that's a great story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Their protection.
Yeah.